I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Brynn Sherman. She is a cognitive neuroscientist and a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania and an expert on the science of learning and memory. Brynn, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is very exciting.
How did you first get into this field?
So I guess I've always been fascinated with memory in particular. I always felt like I had a superior memory to a lot of my peers growing up. And I feel like normally people talk about like, oh, I had such a bad memory, so I got into memory research, but I actually think I was the opposite. But I had always sort of been fascinated by it. And then my sophomore year of undergrad, I started sort of exploring labs. Pretty much every lab I was looking into was learning and memory focused, but I wasn't sure whether I wanted to do animal work or human work. And then I sort of settled in a lab during my sophomore year, and I just immediately fell in love with the topic in the field.
And you fell into a human lab?
Yes, yeah. In retrospect, I wouldn't have been able to handle animal work at all.
Yeah, that makes me want to ask questions about it, but I know that's not your area, so we'll stick to humans. I recently did a podcast with Dan Schachter. Are you familiar with his work?
Yep.
We talked about his book, the 7 Sins of Memory. So that kind of brings up the broad area of like studying memory through memory errors. And then I guess the contrast to that would be studying memory through like successful memory and what can make it better. Where does your research fall on that spectrum?
That's okay. I think mostly studying the errors that people make is where my research mostly falls. Especially right now in my postdoc, I actually just earlier today was analyzing data of memory errors to try to sort of like uncover the structure of memory by looking at patterns of errors. So that's definitely where my mind's at right now. But I think even in grad school, basically a lot of my work was showing like what factors might influence when you forget things or when you fail to encode things.
What does the process look like of collecting that data?
So I've done a few different methods. So I've done a lot of behavioral work and I've done a lot of neuroimaging work. But on the behavior side, it really just involves bringing people into the lab, showing them images, or right now in my postdoc, I'm showing people sort of these illustrations of satellites. So they have all these different modular features. And basically, you just show people things. You can tell them they have to remember, but usually I don't tell them that they have to remember, so that it's sort of a surprise memory test. And then we just ask them to recall things. So we might ask people we might show them an image and ask them to say whether they think they saw that image before or not. Some of the work in my postdoc right now is basically with these stimuli where there are all these different parts. We're just saying, please recapitulate this satellite, and people have to build it up from scratch using a sort of interface where they have to really like reconstruct a very detailed memory. So that's a little bit richer than my previous work, which was just like, do you remember seeing this or not?
What are some of the common errors that people make, or the things that you're trying to uncover?
Yeah, so in my grad school, I was asking how different forms of memory interact with one another. So there's episodic memory, which is what a lot of people think of when they hear memory, which is how do you remember a specific experience, and how do you sort of hold that experience as separate from all of your other related memories? So you probably have memories of every single time that you did this podcast and who you were talking to and what you talked about. But there are also more general forms of memory. So I'm interested in statistical learning, which is how across many related experiences, you can form a more like generalized memory representation. So in addition to the episodic memories that you have for each individual podcast that you recorded, you also probably have some general sense of how these how the podcast typically unfolds, and what sorts of things you typically talk about. And so my work in grad school was looking at how these sort of statistical representations that we have, these generalizable forms of memory, might actually impair your ability to form episodic memories.
Let's dive into the podcast example as a case study of this, because on one hand, you're right. I know that the memories are in there, but on the other hand, we're at like 80 plus now. So there's no way I could list off all the names. So what would probably happen is I'd remember like some standout ones, and then others I would need a cue for, right? What is it that allows some memories to be easily accessible and others you can only remember after like you get some hints?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think yeah, I don't know what causes like the spontaneous recall of memories. I don't typically study that, but I do think that there are a lot of things, a lot of factors that would probably predict that, like salience, or just like how surprising the content of the podcast was, probably like emotional content, if any. And I think probably just like, when I say salience, meaning like having an engaged, like interacting with an engaging person who's going to like capture your attention. So like you probably won't remember mine in a few weeks. But yeah, it's a good question of like what factors would predict just like spontaneous recall versus when you're cued, you will be able to remember an experience.
And then again with the podcast example. So you're going to remember a podcast, but you're certainly not going to remember the entire transcript. You probably won't even remember most of what's talked about. You're going to remember a few key points. So is your brain doing something like that automatically filters out what's unimportant, or like generates a summary, and then only those summary points are what's remembered?
Yeah, it's a good question of how much of that is happening online while you're experiencing it versus like I would think that you are actually encoding. When you're listening to the podcast, you're encoding every word, probably. I mean, you're going to have lapses in attention and you won't encode everything. But for the most part, I would think that probably if you were tested immediately afterwards, you will remember quite a bit of it. But then as time goes on, your memories will probably be dominated by the most predictable or generalizable aspects on like the statistical learning side, but also probably the most salient and surprising aspects on the episodic memory side. And what my grad school work showed is that basically when you're making these predictions, so if you have a really good sense of how a podcast works, so I don't really know what a good example would be here, but like if after you introduce someone, you always asked like the same question immediately afterwards, then basically what my work shows is that your ability to predict that you're going to ask that question will mean that you're actually less likely to remember that question happening. So basically, the extent to which you make a prediction about something actually interferes with your ability to encode that thing.
So could we draw a distinction between remember it something versus like say it happened? Because on one hand, you probably won't remember saying it, but on the other hand, I can tell you what I said and be probably right, despite having no memory of it, just because of like this statistical learning, right? So are those separate processes?
Yes. So there's been quite a bit of work on like the behavioral memory side with these paradigms called remember no paradigms, where basically you present someone with an experience and you have them distinguish between whether they really remember it happening, so whether they actually remember where they were when it happened, what they were doing, and just like really rich aspects of actually re-experiencing that in their memory, or whether they just know that it happened. And so that's mostly been within episodic memory, sort of trying to distinguish the richer, real episodic memories versus just sort of like recognition memory. But I do think that could be extended to looking at like statistical learning versus episodic memory.
Is the latter form the same thing as semantic memory, where it's basically like a fact but not an experience?
Yeah, so semantic memory, I would think, would be a little more like structured and abstracted across many experiences, whereas you could get this like no response by just saying, like the example that you gave earlier of like some podcasts you actually will like just spontaneously recall and remember, and other ones I could say like, did you interview this person? And you could say like, yes, I did, but not actually remember any of the details. So it's still a memory, like a specific, an individual memory in some sense. but it's just not quite as episodic. But it's also not really a semantic memory because it's not like a more generalizable or like abstracted kind of memory, if that makes sense.
So we could take this next question in a very philosophical route or a research route. Is there a difference between knowledge and memory? Like, in order to know something, do you have to have a memory of it? Or can you know something that's kind of just like out there in a knowledge space and then like you tap into it?
So I think that that memories build up knowledge, but I think that over time you then can have knowledge without retaining any of the individual memories.
Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I think that like basically relates to a lot of the work that I'm doing in my postdoc now, which is basically trying to like trace the transformation of memories over time. So when you first learn a concept or like that 2 + 2 = 4, you're going to like learn that over many instances in kindergarten, first grade. I don't even know when you learn that. But like, so basically there's going to be like a point in time where you have this like knowledge that 2 + 2 = 4, but you can also draw on your memories of when you learned that. Like you will be able to access those individual memories. But over time, as it becomes more and more reinforced, those episodes are going to become less accessible and the knowledge is going to become more accessible. So I think there's a lot to be done to really understand that transformation process and when things are more or less accessible. But I think that ultimately you can have knowledge without retaining any of the individual memories.
That makes a lot of sense. So if something is like at the tip of your knowledge structure, like if you're just learning arithmetic for the first time, you're like, oh, I remember the answer because I can imagine, like, if I have 2 apples and add 2 more, I have 4, and you're sort of counting in your head. But then, like, after long enough, you just don't need to do that. You just know it. So the example I just gave was maybe a false example because I used imagination rather than memory. Right. But Dan Schachter has argued that those two are basically the same thing. Does that come into your research at all?
Yeah, so I think that's sort of related to some of the things that I was talking about in terms of prediction. So I am looking at how forming a prediction can interfere with making a new memory. And I think to some extent that's like memory interfering with itself, because when you're making a prediction, especially in my, it's not worth getting into the details of my task, but in my task, it's like you can't make a prediction about the specific thing that's coming next. It's a more abstract prediction. So it is very similar to, it's definitely going to like rely on imagination to some extent. And that seems to interfere with our ability to encode new memories. So it's sort of like this tension between making a prediction and encoding that sort of like prediction or that imagined thing and actually encoding the thing that you're currently experiencing.
So you said that if statistical learning is high, or if something is very repeated, you're less likely to remember it. So that seems to imply that the more novel something is, the more likely you are to remember it. Is that generally true?
Yeah, I think that's generally true. And especially that's true when you're making a prediction and then that prediction is violated. So in cases of prediction error, in many cases, people have shown that those sort of like surprising events are better remembered.
How do you distinguish between surprising versus like so different that it's irrelevant? Because if something falls outside of like the bounds of your predictions, you could regard that as like a significant deviation that you need to learn about. But you could also think like, oh, that's just a weird outlier that I should discard.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting point. And I've been thinking about that a little bit lately because I think, especially in the case of these like very contrived behavioral memory tasks, they really don't disambiguate between those two things. It's just you are taught that this thing is followed by this thing, and then you show the first thing and it's followed by something else. But they don't really manipulate the relevance of that error or how, like, basically the deviance of that from what you expect. It's really very, like, these are in quite arbitrary tasks. But I think it would be really interesting to sort of map out the like space of errors and see if that sort of influences whether you get these memory benefits or whether you sort of just form a new association between those two things that sort of operates in parallel to what the predictive relationship you previously learned. Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to really expand there.
So in psychology, we talk a lot about ecological validity, like whether something can extend beyond the lab and whether it applies to the real world. I imagine that memory research has that. There are some paradigms that are like very lab-driven tasks that you would never encounter in the real world. And then, like, is there such a thing as memory research in the wild?
There is. There's been a lot of work recently to use more naturalistic stimuli. So, for example, showing people movies or TV shows, and then asking them either like doing some sort of neuroimaging during that, or just asking people to recall experiences like that. And I think that that definitely gets more towards real world memory. There's also like the class of studies of like, they've mostly been studying the context of like flashbulb memories. But more recently, there was a paper that came out last year, I think, that basically asked people a bunch of questions about their memories for the 2016 election night. And so you do get some cases, some like studies like that, which are really much more naturalistic. But I do think that most of the existing or current memory work is still on these like pretty arbitrary lab tasks.
Do you do any research on like false memories? So not just making errors, but like constructing things that never happened. Like maybe you tell a story about what happened on that election night. You were at someone's house and it turns out you were never there to begin with. Maybe you were just conflating two different memories or making it up or something.
People definitely do study that. I personally don't, but I do experience this a ton in my work. So like I have this very vivid memory, hopefully it's not a false memory, of when I was developing like the main task that I worked on in grad school. I had been doing it so many times. So it's a task where you're just looking at sequences of scene images. And so I had done it a bunch of times. And when I was doing it one time, I was so certain that there was a bug in my code because I had definitely seen that image like 2 images earlier in the sequence. And then I double checked everything, and that was definitely not the case. And I just was like conflating it from a previous time that I had run myself through the task. And I just thought that was like a very fun instance of like, I'm trying to design this memory task,
Right.
and my own memory is failing me in like a very funny way.
But you've seen all of them so often that it seems like oh, those ones aren't supposed to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. And in this case, they they're very similar. Like they're all pictures of beaches and mountains and lighthouses. So they are all similar to each other too. So yeah.
People have been studying memory rigorously for at least 50 years, right? I can't ask you to summarize the whole history of it, but what are if it would be easy to describe, what are some of the gaps in your field, like the work that you're building off of, that's how's it changed from what was done like maybe 20 years ago, for example?
Yeah. So I think that there's one thing that I'm kind of like obsessed with right now is thinking about like the organization of memory in the mind and brain. So in like the early 90s, starting in the early 90s, but building off of prior work, starting with like HM and other patients, there's been this huge basically dogma in the field of multiple memory systems where different forms of memory are sort of mapped onto distinct brain regions. So the hippocampus is important for episodic memory, and the striatum is important for more like habit-based memory, and the amygdala for classical conditioning. And then over time, people sort of started to update that a little bit. So there was this huge argument that all the hippocampus did was declarative memory. So the hippocampus only was responsible for memories that you could really consciously access. But then people started to realize that actually you can have some more forms of like implicit memory that rely on the hippocampus, and it doesn't necessarily depend on conscious processing. And so they sort of had to refine those theories. But then I think even more recently, there's sort of, I'm trying to make the argument that these mappings are like basically multiple forms of memory can rely on a single brain region in maybe this like interesting way. So this whole episodic memory versus statistical learning distinction, most people would not think that statistical learning should rely on the hippocampus based on the fact that it's this more abstract memory. It sort of is thought to be acquired more implicitly, but actually it does seem to rely on the hippocampus in addition to episodic memory, even though they're like two very opposing kinds of memory computationally. And it seems like the striatum and the amygdala also sort of have these like dueling systems that might basically two opposing kinds of memory that are both supported by those brain regions. And so I think that there's a real opportunity to really like turn this multiple memory systems thing on its head and really just reconsider how memories are organized in the brain and what sort of consequences that has for behavior.
So I imagine there are two different ways you could interpret that. One would be something like keeping the distinction between like these multiple forms of memory. What the new thing we learned is that one region can like produce multiple different functions. The other interpretation would be something like what we thought were separate processes are actually one, and there's just like memory broadly that applies to all these different contexts. So do you think the distinctions are like biologically real, or are they just heuristics we use to understand different contexts of memory?
I think it's a combination of those two. So basically, the point that we're trying to argue in this paper that we wrote recently is that basically so the hippocampus, striatum, and amygdala all can support these two opposing kinds of memory, but that there's a pattern across the three. So basically, they each can support one kind of like more distinct kind of memory. So like episodic memory is when you have to hold a single memory separate from other related memories. The striatum supports sort of like goal-directed associations where like based on a specific context, you have to make like one specific kind of action. And the amygdala can also support very like specific representations between like a stimulus and an outcome. So it seems like across the three brain regions, there's like one sort of subsystem, we call it, that supports these more like specific kind of representations. But then there's also one that supports more general kinds of representation. So statistical learning, habit memories. So you sort of like default to habits in the striatum when you don't have like a specific goal-directed plan. And then the amygdala can also support these more like general memory representations. So I do think that there's sort of like two ways that we think the multiple memory systems theory could be updated, which is both to acknowledge that these regions can support distinct kinds of representations, but also that there might be some similarity across the brain regions in the types of memory representations that they support. So maybe there is a biological difference at the level of why the hippocampus, striatum, and amygdala would care about certain kinds of stimuli or certain kinds of associations, but that there is quite a bit of similarity across the regions in terms of what kinds of memories they might support. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of like generalizing this to real world context, the amygdala you hear a lot about in the context of fear and threat, right? So you can learn like what's threatening, and then striatum is involved in reward, right? So you can learn I guess the opposite of that threat, what to approach. Would you say that the hippocampus is like connecting those two, or like just serving the functional purpose that allows like the amygdala to focus on the negative stimuli and the striatum to focus on positive?
Yeah, I think that I'm not so sure about whether the hippocampus is like involved in coordinating between those two, but I will say that like in terms of like what I just said about like maybe there are biological reasons why these three regions would like support different things. Like you could imagine that like, yes, the amygdala is going to care about it when it's like in the context of fear. The striatum will care about it when it's in the context of reward. And maybe the hippocampus is really good at just forming like arbitrary associations between things.
Right. So another way you could label those, this is probably an oversimplification, but like positive, negative, neutral. So striatum, positive, negative amygdala, neutral hippocampus.
Yep. I think that's that's basically where I was going with that. I do think that is an oversimplification because the hippocampus does interact with the striatum and the amygdala and can be responsive to reward stuff and fear stuff. So I think the other thing that this is like a more boring distinction, but I think the other thing that might sort of distinguish between the three is that the hippocampus, it gets a lot of input from different sensory regions. So it's really good at just taking like two stimuli in the environment and associating them. The amygdala seems to be really sensitive to the relationships between stimuli and outcomes. So like you see a cake and that means you get to eat, or that's not a good stimulus outcome. Like you see a cake and you get like salivation. That would be like stimulus outcome response. Versus the striatum cares about stimulus response outcome. So you see something, you make an action, and then you get an outcome. So like a rewarding outcome in this case. So I think that sort of like the differential sensitivities of these regions to like stimuli, like stimulus pairings versus stimulus outcome versus stimulus response outcome might explain why there's sort of those distinctions.
So is that the same or analogous to the difference between classical and operant conditioning, where for classical you have like a natural response that's pretty much unconscious, like salivating in response to food, and then operant is like you're actually thinking about reward and punishment?
I am blanking on what operant conditioning is. Is
so
operant
would be
instrumental?
like training based on reward and punishment.
So that's when you have to like make
and you
like
actively
press the lever and then you get out of the box.
So like the classical one would be like Pavlov's dogs, where they like the food naturally, and you pair the bell with the food, and then they start to like the bell. They're not necessarily thinking about it. And then for operant, it's like, I don't know, let's say you feed them when they do some behavior that you want to reward, and you punish them if they do something that you want to avoid, and gradually they learn to like avoid peeing on the rug, and they learn to shake your hand when you say shake. But these aren't like natural things that are paired in the same way that classically food and saliva are paired.
Yeah, I think that's true, but in both cases you are sort of manipulating the like reward structure, right? It's just whether because like in both cases it's like a naturally rewarding thing. Like you give a treat after they like correctly shake your hand, right? So I think in both cases it's taking advantage of like inherent rewards, but it's just sort of pairing them through different means.
Right. So the different means seem to be like conscious or unconscious. So that relates to whether there's like the response outcome or like just directly to outcome. Do you see the connection there?
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying. And I will say that I agree with the just outcome versus response outcome, but I'm very hesitant to say whether that's conscious, whether the response is conscious or not. Right. But I do think that the distinction is whether you have to make a response or not.
Does your research focus on like memory in specific contexts, like reward learning or fear learning?
Not reward or fear, but I recently have gotten a little bit into stress research. So looking at how when you are stressed, how you then encode and remember things.
Stress makes your memory worse, is that right?
It depends. Stress is really bad for memory retrieval. So if you're like stressed when you're trying to take a test, that's bad because you might have those memories encoded, but stress is going to basically impair your ability to retrieve the memories. In terms of how stress affects memory encoding, that's actually pretty, there are a lot of studies showing that stress hurts memory. There are a lot of studies showing that stress enhances memory. Here I'm talking about episodic memory. And one thing that seems to matter a lot is whether the content of the memories are like relevant to the stressor, or emotional. So if you have emotional or stress relevant memories, those tend to be enhanced under stress, but neutral information tends to either not be affected by stress or tends to be impaired by stress. So the story of how stress affects encoding is a little unclear.
That seems to make a lot of sense on evolutionary lines. Like if you're stressed, your memory might be worse for everything irrelevant to whatever threat is making you stressed, but then you're gonna like pick up on environmental cues that might be important for survival more.
Yep.
What else are you currently excited about?
That's such a broad question. In my research or in research broadly?
How about both? Or either?
Yeah, so in my research, one thing that I'm going to be starting soon in my postdoc that I have never done before and I'm very excited about is sleep research. So basically, like I was saying earlier, that I'm really interested in looking at the transformation of memories over time. So in my postdoc lab, they actually do a lot of sleep research and they have a sleep lab in the lab space. So we're actually going to be bringing people into the lab, teaching them things, and then having them take a nap in the lab.
And they get paid to sleep.
Yep, they get paid to sleep. And one thing that I think is super cool, which I guess applies to both my own research and research more broadly, is that there's this method called targeted memory reactivation, where basically when you're teaching people things like before sleep, you pair their memories with a sound. And then while they're sleeping in the lab, you can play those sounds to basically try to bias what memories they're replaying during sleep. And this has been shown to basically you get better memory for information for which the associated sounds were played during sleep. And so we're trying to basically bias which memories are replayed during sleep and look to see how that affects various measures of memory. So this is a whole new world for me, but I'm very excited to get that started.
Is this connected to the stress research? Like if you're more stressed, maybe your sleep quality is worse and that interferes with these results?
This is not, that would be an interesting question to ask, but no, those are two separate studies. So this one, the sleep one, doesn't have anything to do with stress.
You think they might be connected if you're comfortable speculating?
Yeah, so there definitely is work on how stress impacts sleep quality, but I'm not familiar with that. But I do think that would be very interesting to see because so in my stress work, we're stressing people and then teaching them things, and then we bring them back to the lab a day later because we basically want, like I just said, stress always hurts memory retrieval, but doesn't necessarily hurt memory encoding. And so we wanted to isolate memory encoding and retrieval. So we brought people back to the lab 24 hours later to test their memory so that it wouldn't be affected by the stress that they had the day before. And so I do think it would be very interesting to look at how basically then we're testing memory a day later. We don't know if that is reflective of differences in memory encoding or differences in memory consolidation. So it would be very cool to be able to sort of track those memories during that consolidation period after stress. And then that would really help us understand the sort of effects that we're seeing a day later.
Could you overview the difference between memory consolidation and what was the other one?
So there's encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. So memory encoding is when you are first experiencing something. So like the active, like perceptual process, you're encoding memories. So you're forming them as you're experiencing them. And then memory consolidation is during sort of offline periods. Mostly people think about this as during sleep. There's going to be some sort of change in your memories probably. So this will be a period of time where, for example, you might sort of, this would be the period of time where you could sort of abstract away from your specific memory that 2 + 2 = 4 from the time that you learned it in elementary school, and form this more like stable, context independent form of that memory. So that's sort of the consolidation process, is how memories change over time. And then memory retrieval would be when you're asked to recall something, or if you spontaneously recall something, that's memory retrieval.
And then when you retrieve it, you're not just retrieving it from a bank and it stays there, right? When you retrieve it, it kind of becomes plastic again and you have to reconsolidate it.
Yep.
Does that lead to like compounding of errors? If you misremember something slightly, then you re-encode that misremembering, and then like that's over time what leads to these bigger memory errors?
I think that's right. I'm not like super up to date with that literature to see if people have done that. I imagine that people have done that. But yeah, so basically the idea, this has been talked about a lot in terms of like fear memories, because you can actually use that like plastic period as a time to basically try to like erase fear memories, because you can change them. But I do, in like this sort of more episodic memory land, there's a theory called multiple trace theory, where it's basically exactly that. So every time you retrieve something, you're like re-encoding it as a new memory into your hippocampus. And so I do think that would predict that you sort of get like some sort of transformation or compounding of errors. If you remember it incorrectly and you don't get any feedback, then you're going to re-encode it as incorrect.
What is the typical timeline of most memory studies? Are most of them done within like a single hour or day, or is the multi-day thing pretty common?
The multi-day thing I think is becoming more common. I think there's been like quite a big like there's been a lot more interest in memory consolidation recently, and tracking memories over time, but it definitely is most common, I think, to just have a single session memory study that takes place over the course of like an hour or two.
Is your work on stress single session?
So that's 2 sessions, for the reason of trying to basically isolate the effects of stress on memory encoding and not retrieval. But
Okay, right. So
basically,
there's sleeping between sessions, but you're not directly measuring sleep like you are on the other study.
Exactly. So I think that there's sort of like, like it's hard to interpret those data to some extent, because consolidation might be at play and that might be related to the stress stuff or not. So it's an interesting conundrum there.
So one possibility, and I guess it sounds like it's yet to be examined, is that stress reduces sleep quality, which could in turn interfere with memory. Then if that's not true, then stress would have to have some more direct pathway to messing with memory. Do you have any idea of what that direct pathway might look like if it's not sleep?
So stress could be affecting the encoding of memories in the first place. So it might be that by the time you've gone to sleep, those memories were already bad to begin with. So there's no additional effect of sleep. It's just that stress hurt your ability to form them in the first place. So they never really existed. And so therefore, sleep wouldn't be doing anything.
Is there a difference between poorly encoded versus like just missing gaps? Or is that the same thing? Like if you have, let's say, a hazy memory, is it hazy because you have, let's say, a complete memory, but it's just very low resolution? Or is it hazy because it's spotty, but let's say the parts that you do have are solid? Does that
I
distinction
think
make sense?
yeah, that distinction makes total sense. I think it could be either. And I think that this is an area where I really feel like memory research could improve upon, is by like doing these more precise memory tests to really try to get at like the aspects of memory that are remembered versus the aspects that are not. Because I think that a huge limitation of like all of my work in grad school, for example, was that we just showed people a scene. We said, do you remember this or not? And we don't have any sense of like the precision with which they remembered that, or like whether they remembered certain aspects of the scene and forgot others. And so I think that having these more precise memory tests can really shed light on a lot of these questions that haven't been addressed.
What is the bigger picture of that? Like once you understand these mechanisms better, how does that translate into whatever you want it to translate into?
I can imagine that meaning a lot of things. Can you?
Yeah, so I didn't want to specify because I didn't want to box it in a specific direction, because like one like real world implication could be like in the medical field, for example, like is this gonna help cure people with memory disorders or whatever? And then another would be something like, I don't know, maybe education or intelligence, or like all of these different avenues that I imagine could benefit from memory research, but I'm wondering if yours is targeted in any particular direction.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's targeted, mostly because I think like there's such a gap there to fill. So I think that like the goal of my work is to just like understand really basic principles of memory, which like surely are relevant to other fields, but I don't know exactly how they are relevant to other fields yet. Like I could, in terms of like understanding whether memories are fuzzy because they're low resolution or fuzzy because certain aspects were encoded and others weren't. Like I'm trying to think about like which of does it from like understanding a disorder of memory, is that important for treatment? I don't know.
When you're dealing with like real basic science research like this, it's sometimes hard to translate. Like there was an analogy I heard once about like asking a physicist who's studying like, I don't know, atom structure or whatever, like what the real world impact is, and they're like, well, you don't need to better understand atoms in order to figure out how to build a bridge. There's like such a huge disconnect that you're just doing it for the basic science at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, hopefully I'm not that abstracted away from the applications. Um, but I think, yeah, basically I just think that like in order to characterize like memory deficits in a population that has memory problems, we need to have like a precise handle on what all of those different forms of memory are that we could be looking at. And so I think that in like it's important to understand the basic memory side in order to be able to better characterize the deficits that people have, which then could ultimately down the line impact like what kinds of treatments are targeting what kind of memory deficits. I do think that like the stress stuff has more direct relevance to um, everyday life though, because it is important to understand how stress influences our memories, because stress is something that everyone experiences all the time.
In looking at the individual differences that you find, no, I'll rephrase that. Do you look for specific like individual differences and draw conclusions about what those means outside of like you're going to see a natural variation in your data no matter what? Like because some people have better memories than others, right? It sounds like you're in that very good memory camp. So what we can frame this in terms of nature and nurture, perhaps.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that there definitely are going to be individual differences in memory. And I think that for the most part, my work tries to work its way around that by I'm looking at like I would be looking for differences in memory within a person as a function of like two conditions. And so yes, there might be some people who are really good at the task and some people who are very bad at the task, but like hopefully we should still see stable, like across people there should be like a stable difference between these two conditions. But in like some areas where I am looking more at individual differences, in terms of the stress study, we can look at in addition to just testing their memory, we also get salivary samples throughout the task so that we can measure cortisol, which is a hormone associated with the stress response. And so one thing that we're planning to look at is whether basically how much their cortisol rises as a function of when we stress them. Does that predict any change in their memory to sort of, I guess you could call that just an individual difference, but I also think that that would allow you to like more precisely map out like the mechanism of like if you did see this really strong relationship between how much cortisol is rising and how much worse their memory is, then you could maybe make a more targeted hypothesis that like cortisol is what is hurting the memory as opposed to like stress broadly. So that's sort of the one area where I'm doing individual differences stuff. Another area that's very different is I have collaborated with people in the med school to look at basically episodic memory and statistical learning performance in people with epilepsy. And basically we found that statistical learning performance can sort of predict epilepsy severity, which has like potential clinical implications, you know, like you could use that as like a diagnostic tool where like individual differences in performance on this task actually track some like meaningful clinical variable.
It's very exciting. Is there anything in your research that we didn't get to cover, Brynn, that you'd like to share with our audience before we wrap up?
I think I bounced around a lot, so I'm not, I don't know if any of it was coherent, but I think I
we
covered quite a bit
covered
of
a
it.
lot, which
Yeah.
hopefully adds to like the novelty dimensions and makes it more memorable, like as we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, we'll see about that.
This was great. Thank you very much for your time, Brynn.
Yeah, thanks so much.